Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens.
Welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. Today, we're going to discuss last week's World Economic Forum in Davos, which was dominated by President Trump's tariff threats over Greenland, and which brought transatlantic relations pretty close to a rupture before Trump ultimately backed down. After that, we'll turn to a conversation with Rick Rossow, Senior Advisor and Chair in India and Emerging Asia Economics at CSIS, about the newly announced EU-India Free Trade Agreement and what it means for each side's economic strategy. We hope you enjoy the show. Max, there was a lot going on last week at Davos and a lot of takeaways, so why don't you walk us through what we saw last week?
I think this will go down in history as one of the most memorable international conferences. This will be pointed to, I think, as a real pivot moment in history. Historians love to have these big kind of showdowns wherever all the leaders are there and things happen. And it sort of reminded me a bit of the Munich Security Conference in 2007, when Vladimir Putin gave what is seen as kind of the rupture moment, where he gives this speech basically attacking the West, attacking the US, and Russia is going to go its own way. And Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, kind of set the note at Davos with a speech calling that the current actions basically of the United States were causing a rupture. I think this was a summit that was really dominated by Greenland and by US threats to conquer Greenland, either through economic coercion or through outright military force. And to maybe walk through the timeline heading into Davos, even before January, this didn't start with the Maduro operation in Venezuela. Let me walk through some of the timeline. A year ago, Donald Trump Jr. went to Greenland, declared that Trump wanted it. J.D. Vance and then National Security Advisor Mike Waltz a few months later went to Greenland. This has been going on for the last year. The Danish embassy folks here in Washington have been under constant pressure from the administration. And the way Denmark has been dealing with this is sort of very much behind the scenes. In December, Donald Trump appointed a special envoy, the governor of Louisiana, to be the special envoy for Greenland, essentially to buy Greenland or to get Greenland for him. This was in the works before the Venezuela operation. Of course, everyone comes back to the office in January. The U.S. does this operation to seize Maduro. That is quite shocking sort of rupture in the international system, especially when it's justified by Trump by saying that the United States wants oil. And then I think the Danes get very concerned that Greenland is next, and that is signaled publicly on social media by Stephen Miller in very aggressive tones. And we see this ramp up in rhetoric from the administration. We then see Denmark trying to go public, trying to encourage its European allies to come and to back it up. And we see that with an Arctic exercise in Greenland that was taking place in January. And in reaction to that, right before Davos, on Saturday, January 17th, Donald Trump announces that he's going to tariff all the countries that sent forces to Greenland. We're talking not a lot of people, but ones and twos here and there, but that Europe sent people to Greenland.
It's important to remember it was a planned operation that was supposed to show resolve in the Arctic.
Right. It was Europeans saying, okay, I guess we're going to interpret your desire to want Greenland as we need to focus more on Arctic security. And so, we're going to do this exercise to demonstrate resolve. I mean, I think there's a double entendre here. I don't think Trump was totally wrong to see this as sort of a sign of resolve. And so he announced tariffs, that the U.S. was going to issue tariffs against these countries. And so the U.S.-EU trade deal had not been ratified by the European Parliament. The EU announces that it would retaliate with more than $100 billion worth of tariffs. The EP, European Parliament, then has frozen its ratification of the US-EU trade deal. And then we get into Davos, and there's this Deutsche Bank report that comes out about looking at whether the Europeans could dump US treasuries. Denmark apparently has been looking to do this. There was also talk of the anti-coercion instrument, and there was going to be a European Council summit, or was a European Council summit on Thursday of that week, where the anti-coercion instrument, which essentially means unleashing the Commission to fight an economic war, was going to be discussed. And so we have Europe tooling up, getting ready. And Scott Bessent comes to Davos, and he's suddenly put on the defensive. He has to defend the US dollar. Christine Lagarde walks out of a speech that Howard Lutnick is giving because he's railing on the Europeans. And I think suddenly what happened here was that part of the Trump administration, probably the Scott Bessent New York economic wing, thought, okay, we can like just take this Greenland thing, and because Europe is dependent on us for security, so we're just going to take it, and they have to accept it because they're dependent on NATO. And what that segment found out at Davos was actually there's going to be real costs here. That if the U.S. went forward, if we actually did a military operation, and there was some real fear that they were actually thinking about it, that there would be real economic blowback. Now, part of that is the point for some of the MAGA wing, for the J.D. Vance, Stephen Miller crowd, that I think are accelerationists, want to destroy the international order. That's why they're pushing this. But they weren't at Davos. So the people in the ear of the president, I think, were like, oh, God, there's going to be real cost to this. Then, hence, Trump gives a speech. It's shocking the Europeans because I don't think they're used to seeing the president speak, maybe in clip form, but not in the full weave version. But the crucial two lines were about him basically taking the threat of military action off the table. And then this sort of off ramp that the Secretary General Rutte has offered, which basically just looks like Denmark will talk to the US about the things that it was trying to talk to the US about for all of 2025. So I think this was the summit that Europe actually demonstrated its resolve. It demonstrated a degree of deterrence. It figured out a way to push back at this administration, and that showed results and may have saved the transatlantic alliance in the end. Sorry, that was a long walk through the TikTok, but I think this was important, and I think the lesson learned for the Europeans is actually, strength is stabilizing.
Yeah, I mean, we could say this, your very own Bergman weave of the news and the transatlantic relationship, but there was a lot going on. I think what's interesting...
I can't really criticize Donald Trump on that.
Well, this is a little bit different, but we'll let you know if it gets there. What's interesting to me, as you said, it was a good example of resolve and unity from the European side. I think that's a blueprint. And von der Leyen talked about this as well, is like we showed unity, we showed resolve, and we did it quickly. I think that's what mattered a lot here. Obviously, we can talk about how decisive they were, talking about the anti-coercion instrument, et cetera. There's still a lot of debate on that, and we should talk about that too. But it was very quick. The unity that they showed on Greenland, it's like, that's not okay. Here's the things we're going to do to retaliate, from the economic to the defense side as well. There was not a lot of European soldiers sent in this exercise, but still, there are several countries that knew they might be in the sights of U.S. administration if they did this, and they were doing it anyway. So all of these, I think, represent a blueprint. Another piece that's interesting to me is Secretary General Mark Rutte seems to be freelancing a little bit throughout this entire exercise. He is the one, obviously, who talked to Donald Trump. You could argue maybe that he helped walk him back from that threat of military force. But the Danes also said, we don't really know what they discussed. We'd like to be kept in the loop for any plans that are being made about Greenland. So it's not clear that he communicated this to his European partners ahead of time. He is also being quite forward-leaning on the importance of retaining, collaboration with the US and making sure we don't divide it up. He said in front of the European Parliament after this whole thing that the European pillar of NATO is empty words. So to me, it's really interesting because there's this EU unity throughout this entire crisis, but you have Mark Rutte over here kind of floating around and still trying to be a Trump buddy. But I don't know what he's hoping to get from this, because similar to how after the first Trump administration, some European allies thought, okay, this was a blip, we'll be okay. That's now a Biden administration. We can continue just as is. This should be an example that it's not going to be like before. And just because Trump walked back the threats to Greenland, at least on the military force side, doesn't mean it's never going to come back. And it doesn't mean he's not going to do other things that will negatively affect the relationship. So I'm kind of confused. I actually would really welcome your thoughts on this as to why Rutte seems so intent on keeping up this relationship the way it is now, when most of the rest of Europe is set now. Okay, we think we have to be very serious about our own future.
I think Charles de Gaulle had a point. His point was that we're under NATO's thumb, right? We're under NATO's thumb and under the American thumb. And he saw NATO as an American construction. Now, the great irony is that it's the Gaullists, under the influence of Charles de Gaulle, that kill the European defense community, and then therefore don't have European cooperation and therefore ensure that America stays forever. So, Charles de Gaulle created essentially America staying forever, but then he pulled France out of NATO military command because he saw that this is an American alliance. This is an American-led alliance. And if you are the Secretary General, there is no European pillar. He's right. There's been talk about this, but it's never been created. European militaries do not know how to work together. They work through the United States.
I think his comment is an accurate representation of what's happening right now, but he seems to be saying it should never come to pass.
Right. And this is where I think it's really pernicious, his comments. And I don't think they're going to go down well in history, particularly if something bad were to happen with Russia or something down the line and the United States is not there. I mean, Rutte's language will come back. And again, not to go to the historians, but I think historians will look at it incredibly negatively. Because here's the thing. It presumes this total European weakness and fecklessness, which is just not true. Ukraine is standing up to a major military power. Democracies are very adaptive. The EU, whenever there's a crisis, adapts. The European countries adapt. It's one of the most well-governed systems in all of human history. If it had to fight Russia, Europe would react, and things would happen very quickly. Is Europe ready to fight together? The answer is no. But the idea that, therefore, Europe should just lie down, bend the knee, and just pray that Donald Trump and the United States would come to Europe's defense when they're clearly signaling that we don't want to. And we know that because the National Defense Strategy released late on Friday night. I actually found out that it was published by a Le Monde story because Americans are publishing their strategic documents so Europeans get to read them first, apparently, when they wake up in the morning. But the National Defense Strategy is basically we don't want to do European defense anymore. We want you to do it. So Mark Rutte is not even channeling what the administration is saying. I think what this is that NATO SecGen is a very bureaucratic position. It's about defending turf. It's about making sure that the EU doesn't impede on NATO turf. And there's been this long-running NATO-EU bureaucratic nonsense about duplication. And Rutte's sharp elbowing, EU, don't get into my space. And if there's a rupture with the United States, how does this thing function? And that is the big problem that European leaders need to realize, that Mark Rutte is not Europe. Mark Rutte is basically acting to advance the bureaucratic interests of NATO. But NATO is not Europe. NATO is not thinking that way. NATO is thinking about how do we maintain this organizational structure so it doesn't go away. But you could find yourself in a situation where America's so enmeshed in NATO and there's a European security crisis and you can't press the NATO button because America, it doesn't want it to be pressed or isn't going to do the things that you thought it was going to do because all your plans are built around the United States. So this is the fundamental problem, is that NATO is not actually thinking about European security right now. It is thinking about how do we maintain America's role in this? How do we perpetuate this? And that is not fact-based. That is not real. That is ignoring the entire reality that you have an American president threatening NATO territory. And the major security crisis that we've been focused on this month is not the war in Ukraine, but is whether the United States is going to do military action against Greenland. And when we thought it was ridiculous, who didn't think it was ridiculous? The Danes. They thought that this was very real, that this could be very real, that a military operation was definitely becoming plausible, if not potentially probable in the next few weeks. And so I think Europe really saved NATO. The EU saved NATO by demonstrating to the United States that there would be real economic cost to this.
There's definitely bureaucratic incentives for the SecGen. I think there's also a lot of personality dynamics. Mark Rutte has always been somebody who thinks about his own position and how he projects on the world stage. But I think he shot himself in the foot pretty significantly towards his other partners in Europe, people who he knows very, very well. That's not going to help him. And I think you were right. He did and said things that actually don't help NATO in the long term. And I thought that was really interesting, but also kind of concerning, all this freelancing from his part. Obviously, it's not the main takeaway from Davos. It's just something that came out of it. We heard other leaders obviously talk about it. You talked about Mark Carney already. He made a really interesting statement, but I think we also want to address what Friedrich Merz said at Davos. Some of what he said is resonant with what Carney said, but I think it's more powerful, especially because he is someone who's speaking for Germany and has deep experience, well, not personally, he was not born, obviously, but experience with a country that is in the middle of a shift in global order. And that's a lot of the conversation that was happening at Davos. But I think you have some thoughts about what Friedrich Merz said last week.
There were a lot of great speeches, actually. Carney sort of stole the show.
And we should say social media has been so good remixing President Macron's speech from like the for sure. People should check that out. The music is excellent.
Macron's shades was a close second to Mark Carney's speech. Ursula von der Leyen's speech was good, very good. What I want to talk about with Merz, I think his speech was good on all the Greenland national security, European security points. But he said something I found interesting in the Q&A. It hadn't occurred to me, and I want to sort of float this out there because there's been a lot of talk about a deregulation agenda from European conservatives at the EU level. Oh my God, there's all this EU regulation, need to deregulate. And that, has been seen in various omnibus bills, especially related to the Green New Deal, where, some of the legislation may have gone a little too far, hard to implement, and they're rolling some of it back. What Merz said made me think that there may also be a broader political framing device happening here with deregulation. And that what he's going to use the term deregulation to mean is basically implementing the Draghi report. And the reason why that kind of came across to me is because Merz was a member of the European Parliament in the late 1980s, early 90s. And that was when the European community pushed forward the Single European Act. This was Margaret Thatcher's great piece of legislation with Jacques Delors. And what is it? Well, it's actually a ton of EU regulations. The idea was that there wasn't actually a single market. You had all these national barriers, all these regulatory barriers. So what you needed was the EU to set regulatory standards to harmonize all these regulations, and then you would get rid of the national regulations. So it was to regulate to deregulate, regulate at the EU level to get rid of national regulation. And what Merz seemed to suggest with the Draghi report is that when the Letta report talked about the 28th regime, that framing Draghi as this well, what we're actually doing is really streamlining regulations with capital markets union so that you can actually invest all over the place and integrate. It's an interesting framing device. I'm not sure that this is right, but it seemed to be what he's suggesting. And then Merz went to meet with Meloni, where they sort of also talked about this. Draghi and Letta are apparently coming to a European Council summit meeting in February. So I think it is really worth watching. Everyone's been decrying the lack of progress on the Draghi report. I mean, it's been 1 year, right? So oh my God, nothing's getting done at the EU, and it's been 1 year.
Meanwhile, their legislative progress is so much faster than the US Congress. So.
Oh my God. It's just, Biden passes the Inflation Reduction Act at the 11th hour, a year and a half into his administration. It's seen as his great accomplishment. But I do think that this year is shaping up where there could be a lot of movement on the Draghi report under the conservative framing that we got to deregulate. We got to reduce barriers to economic competition and trade and all of that. So I wanted to flag that. And if listeners are like, that's crazy, that's totally wrong, let us know. It may totally be wrong. He may just mean no, we really just hate this one social media regulation or whatever. But he was pointing at a bigger effort.
I think that's very possible. There is a lot of pressure from industry because they've seen the writing on the wall. They think that they have a lot of momentum to reduce that European level regulation. There is a lot of demand in different parts of industry. What will be important for Merz in really putting his money where his mouth is he's going to have to show he can go beyond just what is good for German industry. I think that's a balance he's had to strike for a while, and he's always kind of been more on the side of, let's be honest, what would be good for the German economy? What would be good for German industry? Same thing when we were talking about China, Russia, all this stuff. And here, I think it's going to be the same. For example, Capital Markets Union, German banks are not all on board with some of the EU level unification that needs to happen for this and for some of the regulation that needs to happen at the EU level. But he's going to have to show if he really wants to take that mantle and all of that Italy, Germany connections that we're seeing these days, for that to be real, he's going to have to show this. And to me, that kind of connects to what we were talking about with Davos for the Europeans is there's a lot of ambition out there, but to show both deterrence and determination for this competitiveness agenda, they're going to have to show progress soon and important progress. And that doesn't mean obviously deregulating everything. As you were saying, I think it's also showing progress on big ideas like the Draghi report. But there's still those two camps kind of ebbing and flowing, also depending on what the US does. Sometimes there's unity, and sometimes immediately after this crisis, we still saw some Europeans, including Italy, saying, well, great, now we can go back to dialogue, and we should be doing this. So it's going to have to be a real balance between the two, and resolve is going to need to happen at all of these different levels.
I think that's a great place to leave it, and we'll turn to our conversation with our dear colleague, Rick Rossow.
We are thrilled to welcome our colleague Rick Rossow to the Eurofile. Rick is a senior advisor and holds the chair in India and emerging Asia economics at CSIS, where he helps frame and shape policies to promote greater business and economic engagement, with a special focus on tracking and engaging Indian states. He's been working on U.S.-India relations for over 25 years. Rick, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Let me give a brief summary of what's in front of us here with this deal. So at the top, we should say the EU as a whole bloc is India's largest trading partner, although very close second is the United States and then China. And this deal would cover close to 2 billion people. So it's not nothing. That's also why they're calling it kind of a mega deal. In short, the agreement cuts or reduces tariffs on about 96.6% of EU exports to India. That includes cars, alcohol, spirits, you know how Europeans love their spirits, machinery, etc. It also removes tariffs on Indian textiles to the EU, which are currently at about 10%. And about $75 billion worth of Indian exports will get preferential entry status in the EU. We knew ahead of time that some of the sticking points before the signing of the agreement were going to be human rights and some green transition requirements, including CBAM, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And we're going to talk about that with you. There's something the EU can do to help with this. And importantly, large areas of agriculture, which is a very touchy subject on both sides, they remain mostly out of the agreement. So that's the baseline for the deal. It took years of negotiation. So in your mind, what finally broke that logjam, and what should we really remember from this deal?
Yeah, it's almost 20 years since they began negotiations, although there was a really long pause kind of in the middle of that. Really began to accelerate just a few years ago. But the big change was, I think, during Modi's second term, which began in 2019. You began to see a change in India where there was a lot more openness to trade agreements, where there was this recognition that if you want to become an active player in global supply chains, global value chains, you need to have relatively relaxed restrictions on imports to be able to acquire what you need, whether it's capital equipment, raw materials, intermediate goods. You need that low barriers to trade to be able to expand your own exports. And that really began to set in. I remember when India first kind of showed that inkling that there was an interest in trade agreements. I went out, spent about 2 weeks, met with not just the usual cast of characters in the central government, but some of the political groups and far-right nationalist groups. And you kind of felt that there was an understanding. India can't win unless they reduce some of these barriers. And I think for Europe to have watched on the sidelines as India began to sign increasingly robust agreements in recent years with the UK, with Australia, with New Zealand, with Oman, with UAE, a whole range of agreements, and improving some of the commitments they made over time, I think Europe realized that it wasn't just CBAM and human rights, but they really wanted India to show an inclination to give more than what they already had for national commitments, bound rates on tariffs and that kind of stuff. And they saw increased interest. And I think that gave a little spring in Europe negotiator step that India was ready for a better deal than would have been possible 15, 20 years ago. Wait a little bit longer, and sometimes things change in Delhi, and the time was certainly right to get a better deal than would have been possible.
So from your perspective, what was the key driver? We'll get into the meat of the deal in a minute, but it seems like from what you're saying is that India was ready for this. India was looking to do more trade agreements. And so from your perception, it was Europe that sort of changed here, or was it India that also moved? What was the sort of geopolitics kind of the key factor in triggering this? It comes a week after Davos and Mark Carney's speech and concerns about the reliability of the United States. When you just sort of think about the political factors at play, do you think this was Europe sort of dropping some of its demands, being more flexible because it recognized it needed a deal, or is that equivalent on both sides?
No, I think India changed more. And I think Europe was following very closely and realized the time was right to restart serious negotiations because India would be more open to making significant commitments on tariffs, on labor and immigration, on services. The material for getting a deal that would actually unlock commercial opportunity was much higher because of a change of mindset on trade that you saw in Delhi than what you had previously. But, tip of the hat to Europe negotiators for realizing the time was right, not to kind of put India in the corner, which a lot of Americans still do. I mean, I think a year ago when the United States announced the intention to negotiate a trade agreement, most of the calls I was getting was like, how do we get India to really want to do this? Well, both political parties in the United States are pretty anti-trade in recent years. India, at that point, I'd say like they're signing deals, they're reducing duties. We didn't know how bad the Trump administration would be on imposing tariffs and stuff. But even a year ago, kind of recognized that India's evolution had been pretty stark and quick. And I think you look at this long network of deals India signed recently, they've focused almost exclusively on developed countries. And I think that's also a recognition when Modi first came to office back in 2014, and you began to see this real drive on Make in India, local manufacturing, increased trade restrictions. And the focus a lot of times was on high-tech industries. And at that point, India wasn't even that successful in low-tech stuff. Bangladesh still is eating India's lunch on ready-made garments, for instance, which typically is kind of close to the starting point for countries that want to move up that curve on manufacturing. And I think you look at India's trade agreements and its trade policy now, and they realize we do have relative strength. This is India speaking. We do have relative strength in labor-intensive industries. We are not as strong today in capital-intensive industries. There's a deal to be had that'll increase jobs, increase trade, and Europe and developed countries like that are actually become the prime target. So India wants to be a leader of the global south, but you look at the substance they're putting on the table, at least with trade agreements, and they've actually been knitting together the global north in a significant way.
I'm curious, what do you think that means? What is Modi trying to get out of this? What's the economic policy he's been implementing, what he's hoping this will do? Because there's been a lot, obviously, of changes in India. And are there potential hurdles for him in the implementation, parts of the maybe economic world that might be a little bit resistant to this because of this history of protectionism? Where is he starting from? Where is he hoping to go with this deal?
Yeah, I think, India's vantage point is not unlike the United States and a lot of other countries. They want to have, I think, sort of rebalance the economy a little bit, move away, if they can, a little bit faster from agriculture, but they still want to keep the market protected. And so in negotiations with most countries, basic staple grains and such aren't going to be part of the trade agreement because most Indian farmers have no hope about having a supply chain as robust enough where they can get basic grains on a boat to Europe or something like that. So, that part is kind of kept out of trade agreements, but they're using trade agreements as a way to try to stoke growth in manufacturing. Here in the United States, we're hoping it'll cause a resurgence in manufacturing. For India, they hope to have really would be their first industrial revolution. And they need that because, again, if you're going to really kind of improve the livelihood of workers as they shift away from agriculture, you got to have something for them to do. They're not going to move into India's vibrant high-end services market. If you only got an 8th grade education, let's say, and you're not proficient in English or something like that, which is how a lot of India's services trade operates, low-skilled manufacturing and assembly jobs is really kind of that first point you kind of jump onto. And so I think that's part of the driving imperative for India. They want to create jobs. They also want to improve the balance of trade. Again, look at it from the U.S. lens. We've got both parties grappling with trade in a significant way. Our trade deficit to GDP, is somewhere around 2.5%, 3% most years. India's has been as high as 12% in recent years. That's their goods trade deficit as a percent of GDP. So the imperative there as well to try to be a little more competitive, have some of that local manufacturing production. It is about balance of trade as well. So I think for India's vantage point, job creation and balance of trade, two themes which are not uncommon for a lot of us, but the imperative India has is much bigger. You think half the population is still in basic agriculture. Job creation, it's of a different scale than it is with most countries. And the point I brought up about the trade deficit. So not shocking to hear those two as the big drivers for what they're lashing onto. But the magnitude that India deals with on both fronts is beyond the United States by orders of magnitude, beyond most European countries. So they need to move fast. And that's what I think caused the reorientation.
Let's talk about the deal. What do you think is the most significant aspect of it? There's been a lot of attention, especially in the European press, on automotive sector. I think a huge increase in the quotas and the amount of cars that can be sold into India. Maybe one of the most significant things is actually on the supply chain side, that it also a lot of the components that go into manufacturing, those tariffs are going to be reduced. So it enables more kind of European investment into the Indian auto sector. So what is your assessment of how significant this deal is? What are the key elements that you see in it?
Yeah, I mean, it's very significant today. India is the fastest growing large economy in the world, expected, even despite the fact that, India's primary economic partner is the United States. And there's a lot of choppiness in those waters with the Trump administration, tariffs and such. But still, despite that, India is growing somewhere north of 7% this year. for a $5 trillion economy that's just on the verge of passing Germany and Japan to become the world's third largest economy, for Europe to have a much stronger level of market access. And you mentioned a lot of the sectors where I know European companies have got to be pretty hungry for additional access, but you see reductions in basic industries, things like chemicals, iron and steel. You see market access in pharmaceuticals, motor vehicles, you mentioned. There's some areas that are excluded, like cheese, because India's got a vibrant dairy industry that gets back to that kind of basic agriculture sector that they've kind of blocked things out. But even on alcohol, spirits, wine, you see some relaxation there. So, but there still are some elements that we got to see the details for. They did announce that they've offered some pretty interesting provisions as well in market access for foreign investment into India in financial services and insurance. And considering India's done some big reforms in those sectors in recent years domestically, I'm wondering, like, what level of market access are European banks and insurers going to get that maybe haven't been offered to American companies, Japanese companies, and others as well. So I think there's still a couple of elements that when we see the granularity and details when they're released, that those might also be pretty explosive. But top line, you mentioned it, it's tariffs. So there's a lot of European companies that are going to get market access. But as we saw with India's other agreements as well, including with the Swiss-led EFTA group, those countries did announce that they're going to make quantum investment into India over time. You have seen labor mobility and flexibility, and we know some of those announcements are there in the Europe agreement as well. Services hasn't always gotten as much attention with India's deals, and the fact that with Europe, they do have a more robust services chapter, it again shows India continues to use every agreement as another step up in what they're willing to commit to. So tariffs for sure, financial services, labor mobility, these are some of the things that struck me as most important.
And we know that ahead of the signing of the deal this week, one of the potential hurdles was on the green chapter. From the EU, obviously, there's very specific regulation. They're trying to push decarbonization at home, but also abroad. And at the top about the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. But it sounds like they found a way to make this potentially something that they're working on together, because both sides, as you said, really wanted this deal, and that wasn't a way to get around to this. What drove this from the India side, that there's maybe more willingness now, or they just didn't have enough investment capacity before to push some of those industries to decarbonize?
I think India's got mixed views when they think about European Union. Mostly they think about their individual relationships with individual countries. And when you think about it that way, only Germany and Netherlands actually rank among India's 20 largest trade partners. So when things like CBAM come up, on one hand, they can kind of dismiss individual countries, don't look that important. Why do we want to change a lot of our local policies because of that? But I think as they approach trade agreements again, the re-recognition in India that at least on trade, there is a lot more cohesion, that you can have a single agreement that opens up a lot of doors. Then suddenly, when you think about Europe in total, as you brought up in the opening, it's slightly ahead, or at least on par with the level of goods trade with the United States and China. It's right up there as India's tier one. You do hear in the last year or two, I've heard certainly at the national government level in India and state governments. As you mentioned, our program engages state governments more than any U.S. organization does. And you hear CBAM brought up a lot more now. They do realize that they are at risk of losing exports to one of their largest export markets if they don't start making some changes. Now, in India, you talk about green commitments, and most trade agreements, they simply say that on law, you have to have certain labor regulations. India has always had no problem with having great looking laws and regulations. It's more a question about implementation. And there, for Europe, at least on CBAM, to talk about establishing some consultations and coaching for India and how do you get it right and how do you make sure that your suppliers are kind of meeting objectives, that's a good step, because it's never been about having a good looking policy, I don't think. It's more about how do you implement. And if Europe's willing to take that extra step and help Indian companies make sure that they're actually executing in practice so they can meet commitments, that's probably more what India needs than to press India to have some good looking policy on paper. We've done studies of India's small business policies. India, they've got money. The state governments have money for small business to do audits, to buy equipment that'll help them to reduce the energy footprint and such. But in practice, it just doesn't happen that much. Companies don't know it exists, or the state doesn't want to spend the money to actually do it, so they don't talk about it much. So there's a lot of good work on execution, and I think Europe can play a role there. So it's good to see that they're not just getting stuck on this idea about having a perfect piece of paper, but thinking more about implementation. I think it's a great step.
And that's a pretty good blueprint, I think, for the EU too, because CBAM is a pretty complex mechanism, and it could be a way forward with deals with other countries that might have a hard time understanding how to implement it, to say, hey, we come with a manual.
Yeah. That's the strange thing about India, right? You look at it two ways. One is on a per capita income basis, or many other ways, we still think it's a relative small player, but you do think it's about to become a $5 trillion economy. mid-century, it's going to be as large as Europe, a $20 trillion economy. And with that kind of momentum, by the end of the century, it's going to have double China's population. So India is able, of course, to demand things that a lot of other small and medium countries can't. I think for those that think about India today or India 10 years ago, they don't have much negotiating leverage. But for those Americans and Europeans that think this is about to become one of the three economic behemoths of the world, well, then you're willing to give a little bit more too. So, on good days, India knows it's got a lot of weight they can throw around to get things and extract, for instance, like the EFTA deal, the $20 billion of investment that they got committed from a relatively small group of European countries. That's a big deal from India's vantage point to negotiate those things. Not every mid-market country can.
Yeah, I think your comments just now, Rick, I think would be music to the ears of many of the officials in Brussels when they concocted CBAM, really saw it as, well, this is trying to be sort of a forcing function, right? If the EU is going to spend all this money modernizing its economy, decarbonizing, making its sectors potentially less competitive, well, you can't just let goods come in. And so they wanted to see progress and momentum. And I think it's having somewhat of a flexible take on implementation, I think is really useful.
I mean, India, even in practice, they do have some things moving steadily in the right direction. But the top line is renewable energy. India, both in wind and solar, is among the world leaders in both fronts. About half of installed energy capacity is actually renewable energy, if you include large hydro in that as well. So that's one of the big factors. How do you decarbonize? Energy tends to be the largest source of carbon emissions. And, the fact that India has went so aggressively in pursuit of renewable energy, there is some good things happening on the ground, too, apart from just nice paperwork and that kind of thing. That's going to help India actually kind of meet some of its commitments and decarbonize, because they're doing it on the energy grid, even if they're a little slower on second order and third tier decarbonization things for industry.
Actually, great study, I think this morning from Ember that looks at India, comparing it to sort of the path that China and the US has taken. And it looks like India is sort of rounding the curve on decarbonization well ahead of where China and the US were. I want to maybe pivot as we're running close to time about the geopolitics of this. Ursula von der Leyen and Antonio Costa, which I think Modi called him the Lisbon Gandhi because Antonio Costa's grandfather, I think, hails from Goa and is an overseas citizen of India. But it seemed like there were great vibes to the visit. They were there on India's Republic Day. There was an amazing parade. The Indians do great military parades. And, part of this comes in the context of there is a war on in Europe, Ukraine and Russia. Russia has long been a partner of India. There's also the context of China's rise of US-China competition, as well as Europe increasingly concerned about Chinese dumping of goods and about China's role in the world. So maybe you could assess, what are the geopolitics of this from an Indian perspective? Do you think this sort of could lead to maybe a softening of India's support for Russia? Or is that kind of well into the future? What's the geopolitical significance here?
Yeah, I think geopolitical significance is pretty light. This is a commercial deal. I think when you're in Delhi and you're thinking about your strategic threats, it's China and Pakistan. And in China, I think India looks at Europe on the wrong side of the road half the time. With Pakistan, Europe doesn't really have any role to play. And so, strategically, I don't think India looks at Europe as a significant additive for what it considers its main security threats from its own neighborhood. And as you rightly point out, from Brussels' view, India is on the wrong side of history as well by supporting Russia. I mean, the relationship, that too, it's mostly a trade and commercial relationship. I mean, I travel through India and you don't have Indian officials that dream about sending their kids to Moscow for university, right? It still is the United States and to some extent Canada and Australia and such. But Russia offered a level of military equipment and transfer of intellectual property that up until recently, the United States and nobody else was willing to do. Increasingly, post the invasion, to be able to secure reliable access at low cost for energy. The strategic depth of the India relationship with Russia, we overstate it sometimes. They're not in the trenches fighting wars together, but India does take advantage of Russia's openness on sharing things that others haven't in the past and today. So I think when you do look at the strategic threats and strategic outlook from both capitals, there still isn't a lot of overlap in terms of the position they're taking. If Brussels becomes more aggressive on China and India feels that there's a role to play, if another border flare up between India and China, as Indian officials say, there's only one country that picked up the phone and called and said, "What do you need?" The United States. That's it. So India's got some level of complexity in its security relationship with France and to some extent the UK, but nobody picks up the phone when India's in a crisis too. And that provided India a fig leaf to say, we don't care about your Russia thing, because nobody called when China invaded and we had troops killing each other at the border. I mean, that was a more narrow thing. But for India, anytime you're losing territory, it's a significant thing. So I think geostrategically, this is not that. This is a trade agreement that's going to unlock economic promise in both. And over time, of course, they'll have a little more pull for strategic thinking. But when you think about the strategic priorities, the security priorities, still not a lot of overlap between the two. But on a commercial front, this is a pretty banner week.
Maybe just quickly, one last question on the defense side. One of my first issues in government that I had to deal with when I entered the State Department was when the U.S. lost the India fighter competition to those evil French with their Rafale fighter jets. And maybe on the defense industrial side, because that does seem an area where the Europeans are now really investing in their defense industrial capacity. India is constantly looking to modernize its defense forces. Do you see that as potentially an area for real growth and where the relationships between European countries, the EU, and India could blossom?
It can. I think that kind of echoes a U.S. perspective on trying to get India away from buying so much defense material from Russia. Our first instinct, of course, is buy more American stuff. And we spent years, and you're talking about the medium multi-role combat aircraft. We kind of felt cracking the door open on the nuclear deal. We were almost owed the F-16 or the F-18, but of course it wasn't the right fit for the job. I think we spent probably 10 years really kind of focusing on getting India to buy more American stuff and maybe some local production as kind of part of that. But then I think, especially during the Obama administration, at the time that Ash Carter was the deputy secretary and later secretary of defense, he personally kind of led this drive to realize probably the best pathway to getting India to buy less Russian stuff is to help India make its own stuff. That is not our first choice. We'd much rather sell stuff that we make here, the job creation, the interoperability. But really, the right answer for the United States became, if we help India build its own defense industrial base, that's probably the best way to stop them from buying so much from Russia, which is, of course, an important economic lifeline to Russia during this period. And I think if Europe has or comes to that same kind of conclusion, selling is great, but helping them is probably next best to get them off the Russia hook, then I think that's a real opportunity as well. So there's some space there. I don't know how far along Europe is on that curve, because we all, of course, want to improve sales first. I mean, it's our military industrial base is an important job creator, and it's got political imperative behind it. But if Europe gets to that point, if they're already at that point, that could be a big driver. I'm glad you brought that up.
Rick, I want to thank you so much for joining the Eurofile. This has been a great conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate you. Thanks for having me on.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producers Shannon Young, Otto Svensson, and Lexi Linefelter for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.